90 days. That is the number that Western defense analysts, NATO intelligence assessments, and independent military logistics researchers have converged on as the outer boundary of Russia's current sustainable ammunition production and reserve capacity at the consumption rates the war in Ukraine is currently demanding. 90 days of artillery shells, 90 days of the missile inventory that Russian military doctrine requires to sustain offensive operations at the tempo Russian commanders have maintained across the Eastern Front. 90 days of the ammunition ecosystem that keeps Russian forces in the field as a coherent offensive military force rather than a defensive one, making strategic retreats to preserve what it can no longer afford to spend. 90 days. And here is what nobody covering this number is saying clearly enough. The 90-day figure is not a prediction about when Russia loses the war. It is not a prediction about when Russian forces collapse or when Ukrainian forces achieve a decisive territorial breakthrough. It is a prediction about when the nature of this conflict changes so fundamentally that every assumption currently governing how Western governments, NATO planners, Ukrainian military strategists, and the global community watching this war are thinking about its trajectory becomes obsolete. What happens after 90 days is not the end of the war. It is the beginning of a different war. A war fought under different conditions, with different military logic, producing different outcomes than anything the current trajectory suggests. And understanding what that different war looks like, who benefits from it, who is destroyed by it, and what it means for every country whose security calculations are built around assumptions about how this conflict resolves, is the most important geopolitical analysis available to anyone trying to understand where the world is heading in the next 6 months. Here is that analysis, all of it. Subscribe right now if you follow this conflict, because what we are about to explain changes how you understand every battlefield development you have watched unfold over the past several months. Drop a comment telling us whether you think 90 days is accurate or whether Russia's real timeline is longer or shorter. We are reading every assessment because the range of expert opinion on this number tells you something important about the limits of what public intelligence can verify. Part 1, where the 90-day figure comes from and why it should be taken seriously. The 90-day figure did not emerge from a single source or a single methodology. It emerged from the convergence of multiple independent analytical streams that approached Russia's ammunition sustainability from different directions and arrived at similar conclusions. Understanding where the number comes from is essential to understanding how much confidence it deserves and what the range of uncertainty around it means for the analysis that flows from it. The first analytical stream is production capacity assessment. Russia's defense industrial base has been operating under wartime mobilization conditions since early 2023. The mobilization has produced real increases in production output across multiple ammunition categories. Russian artillery shell production has increased significantly from its pre-war baseline. Missile production has been sustained through supply chain adaptations that Western sanctions were initially expected to prevent more effectively than they have. The production increases are real and documented. They are also insufficient to replace ammunition at the rate the war is consuming it. The gap between production and consumption is the foundational calculation that produces the 90-day figure. Russian artillery consumption rates on the Eastern Front have been documented through a combination of satellite imagery, acoustic monitoring, battlefield reporting, and Ukrainian military intelligence assessments that Western defense establishments treat as broadly reliable. Those consumption rates consistently exceed Russia's documented production capacity by a margin that, when applied to the reserve inventory estimates derived from pre-war stockpile assessments and estimated consumption since February 2022, produces a timeline in the range of 60 to 120 days, depending on which consumption rate assumptions and reserve inventory estimates the analyst uses. 90 days is the central estimate of that range. It is not a precise figure, and the analysts who produced it would be the first to acknowledge the uncertainty embedded in every input that feeds it. But it is the figure that the convergence of independent assessments has produced, and the convergence itself is analytically significant even when the individual inputs carry uncertainty. The second analytical stream is logistics and supply chain assessment. Russia's ammunition supply chain is a complex system that connects production facilities distributed across Russian territory to forward logistics bases near the front line and ultimately to the artillery units and missile batteries that consume the ammunition in combat operations. The system has vulnerabilities that Ukrainian military operations have been specifically targeting since the war began. Ukrainian long-range strike operations against Russian logistics infrastructure have destroyed documented quantities of ammunition at storage facilities, transit points, and forward supply positions. Those documented losses are not fully captured in consumption rate calculations because they represent ammunition that was produced and transported but never fired. They represent losses from the supply chain rather than from combat consumption, and they reduce the effective reserve inventory below what production and combat consumption figures alone would suggest. The third analytical stream is financial and economic assessment. Russia's defense budget has been expanded dramatically to fund wartime production levels. The expansion is real. The sustainability of that expansion under the combined pressure of Western sanctions, oil price volatility, and the structural constraints of a wartime economy that is diverting resources from civilian consumption to military production is the subject of legitimate analytical disagreement. What is not subject to legitimate disagreement is that the financial cost of sustaining current ammunition production levels is generating economic pressures that Russian economic planners are managing through mechanisms that have known long-term costs. The depletion of reserve funds, the monetization of government debt, and the suppression of civilian consumption that funds military production all create economic vulnerabilities that compound over time in ways that the 90-day ammunition figure does not capture, but that inform the broader question of what Russia's military capacity looks like beyond the immediate timeline. Part 2. What Russian military doctrine requires and why the ammunition constraint matters differently than it sounds. To understand what happens when Russia's ammunition sustainability reaches its limit, you need to understand what Russian military doctrine requires ammunition to do. Because ammunition is not simply a resource that Russian forces consume in combat. It is the foundational element of the specific military approach that Russian commanders have employed throughout this conflict, and that has defined the character of the war in ways that go far beyond the simple question of how many shells Russian artillery fires per day. Russian military doctrine in this conflict has relied on artillery dominance as its primary tactical instrument. The operational logic is straightforward. Overwhelming artillery fire degrades Ukrainian defensive positions, suppresses Ukrainian counter-battery fire, and creates the conditions under which Russian infantry and armor can advance with acceptable casualty rates. The artillery dominance approach requires ammunition at scale. Not just adequate ammunition, but artillery fire superiority that is so complete that Ukrainian forces cannot maintain defensive positions without accepting casualty rates that degrade their combat effectiveness faster than reinforcement can replace it. That approach has worked imperfectly, but sufficiently to sustain Russian territorial ambitions throughout the conflict. It has worked at an ammunition cost that the 90-day figure suggests is no longer sustainable at current rates. And when it stops working, because the ammunition required to sustain it is no longer available at the scale the doctrine requires, Russian commanders face a choice that military doctrine is not well equipped to prepare them for. The choice is between two options that are both institutionally painful for a military culture built around the artillery dominance approach. The first option is to reduce operational tempo to match sustainable ammunition consumption rates. This means conducting fewer offensive operations, accepting slower territorial progress, and ceding the initiative to Ukrainian forces in sectors where reduced Russian artillery activity creates operational opportunities. Reduced operational tempo does not mean defeat. It means accepting a lower rate of progress and a longer timeline for achieving operational objectives while preserving the force for a sustained campaign rather than an intensive one. The second option is to concentrate available ammunition on priority axes of advance and accept reduced artillery support on secondary fronts. Concentration allows Russian forces to maintain offensive momentum in selected sectors at the cost of reduced capability in others. It creates tactical opportunities in the concentrated sectors while creating tactical vulnerabilities in the sectors where ammunition has been reduced. Ukrainian military planning that correctly identifies the concentrated sectors and the reduced sectors can exploit the vulnerabilities created by concentration in ways that offset the gains produced by the concentrated offensive operations. Both options represent fundamental departures from the artillery dominance approach that has defined Russian military operations. Both options change the character of the war in ways that affect every other actor in the conflict. And both options produce a battlefield environment that is genuinely different from the one that exists today. Part 3. What happens to Ukraine when Russia's ammunition constraint becomes operationally binding? Ukraine's military strategy has been shaped by the reality of Russian artillery dominance since the early months of the conflict. The defensive postures Ukrainian forces have maintained, the fortification systems they have constructed, the tactical decisions their commanders have made about where to hold ground and where to trade space for time, all of these have been calibrated to the reality of operating under Russian artillery dominance. When that dominance is reduced by an ammunition constraint that changes the scale and tempo of Russian artillery operations, Ukrainian military planners face a strategic environment that is more favorable in some dimensions and more complicated in others than the environment they have been operating in. The favorable dimension is the most immediately obvious. Reduced Russian artillery fire means reduced casualty rates for Ukrainian forces holding defensive positions. It means reduced destruction of Ukrainian fortification systems. It means reduced suppression of Ukrainian counter-battery operations. And it means reduced logistical pressure on Ukrainian supply chains that have been operating under the constant threat of Russian artillery interdiction. Every one of these improvements in the operational environment creates opportunities for Ukrainian forces to do things they could not safely do under full Russian artillery dominance. The more complicated dimension is less immediately obvious but equally important. Ukrainian military strategy has been built around the assumption of Russian artillery dominance. The institutional knowledge, the tactical doctrine, the command culture, and the force structure that Ukrainian forces have developed over 3 years of operating under that dominance are optimized for a specific type of warfare. When the defining characteristic of that warfare changes, because Russia's ammunition constraint alters the character of Russian artillery operations, Ukrainian forces must adapt their approach to a new operational environment that their existing doctrine was not designed for. Adaptation is possible. Ukrainian forces have demonstrated throughout this conflict an institutional flexibility and learning capacity that has consistently exceeded the expectations of external observers. But adaptation takes time and resources and creates transitional vulnerabilities during the period between when the old approach stops being optimal and when the new approach is sufficiently developed to be effective. The 90-day timeline is not long enough to complete that adaptation if it begins at the moment Russia's ammunition constraint becomes operationally binding. Ukrainian military planners who understand the 90-day figure are not waiting for the constraint to become binding before beginning the adaptation. They are developing the operational frameworks for a post-artillery dominance battlefield now, while the current environment still provides the time to develop them without the pressure of immediate operational necessity. Part 4. What Russia does when the ammunition runs out, and why the answer is more dangerous than it sounds. Here is the analysis that the coverage of Russia's ammunition constraint consistently underweights. When Russia's conventional ammunition sustainability reaches its operational limit, the response is not surrender. It is not negotiation driven by military necessity. And it is not the kind of strategic defeat that produces the outcomes Western governments and Ukrainian planners are hoping the ammunition constraint will eventually generate. The response is escalation calculation. Russian military and political leadership facing an ammunition constraint that reduces their conventional military effectiveness will assess the escalation options available to them and calculate whether any of those options produce outcomes preferable to accepting the operational limitations that the ammunition constraint imposes. That calculation is the most dangerous moment in the entire trajectory of this conflict because the escalation options available to Russia are not limited to conventional military options. The tactical nuclear option is the escalation that Western governments are most concerned about and most publicly focused on. Russian military doctrine includes provisions for the use of tactical nuclear weapons in conventional conflicts where Russian forces face operational defeat. The ammunition constraint does not constitute operational defeat in the doctrinal sense that would trigger those provisions, but an ammunition constraint that is severe enough to fundamentally degrade Russian conventional military effectiveness creates a situation that Russian military planners might assess as trending toward conditions that approach the doctrinal threshold for tactical nuclear consideration. The assessment of how close the ammunition constraint brings Russian military planning to that threshold is the most sensitive intelligence question in the entire conflict. Western governments that have access to classified assessments of Russian military decision-making are watching the ammunition figure not just as a conventional military metric, but as an indicator of the escalation calculation pressure that Russian leadership is operating under. The 90-day figure is not just a countdown to a change in conventional military dynamics. It is a countdown to a point where the escalation calculation pressure on Russian leadership increases in ways that the conventional military analysis does not fully capture. The non-nuclear escalation options are less catastrophic than tactical nuclear use, but more likely to be exercised and more complex to manage. Expanded targeting of Ukrainian civilian infrastructure beyond current levels, increased use of Iranian-supplied drones against targets that current operational patterns have avoided. Expanded cyber operations against NATO member infrastructure designed to complicate Western support for Ukraine without crossing the threshold of direct military engagement with NATO forces. Each of these options represents an escalation that Russian leadership might calculate is preferable to accepting the operational limitations imposed by an ammunition constraint that reduces their conventional military effectiveness below the level required to sustain current campaign objectives. Part 5. What the world looks like 90 days from now. 90 days from now, the war in Ukraine will be a different war from the one being fought today. Not because Russia will have run out of ammunition on day 90 in a clean transition that produces an identifiable before and after moment. Because the ammunition constraint will have been building in its operational effect throughout the 90-day period, and the cumulative effect of that building constraint will have changed the battlefield environment in ways that are difficult to reverse regardless of what subsequent ammunition production or procurement produces. The Western alliance supporting Ukraine will be navigating a strategic environment that is simultaneously more favorable in conventional military terms and more dangerous in escalation terms than the environment that exists today. More favorable because reduced Russian artillery dominance creates operational opportunities for Ukrainian forces that current conditions do not provide. More dangerous because the escalation calculation pressure on Russian leadership increases as conventional military effectiveness decreases in ways that the improved conventional military environment does not offset. The countries in Russia's immediate neighborhood whose security calculations are built around assumptions about how this conflict resolves will be reassessing those calculations in real time as the 90-day constraint produces its operational effects. The Baltic states, Poland, Finland, and the other NATO members closest to Russian territory are watching the ammunition figure not just as observers of a neighboring conflict, but as countries whose security planning is directly affected by what Russia's conventional military capacity looks like when the constraint becomes operationally binding. China is watching the ammunition figure with the most sophisticated analytical attention of any external observer. China's assessment of what Russia's ammunition constraint reveals about the sustainability of conventional military operations against well-supplied Western-backed opponents is directly relevant to China's own military planning for scenarios involving Taiwan and the South China Sea. The lessons China draws from the 90-day figure and from Russia's experience of fighting a prolonged conventional war against a determined opponent with Western logistical support will inform Chinese military procurement, doctrine, and strategic planning in ways that extend far beyond the immediate context of the Ukraine conflict. The global energy and commodity markets whose behavior has been shaped by the war's trajectory will respond to the ammunition constraints' operational effects in ways that affect economies far removed from the conflict itself. A change in the character of the war, produced by Russia's ammunition constraint, is a change in the geopolitical risk environment that energy markets, commodity markets, and the financial markets that price geopolitical risk will need to reassess in real time. 90 days, the number that changes the war, the number that changes the escalation calculation, the number that changes the strategic environment for every country whose security planning is built around assumptions that the current trajectory of this conflict will continue. The war does not end after 90 days. It transforms. And the transformation is the most important geopolitical development of the next 6 months, regardless of what else happens in the world during that period. Drop your comment right now. Do you think Russia finds a way to extend beyond 90 days, or does the constraint become operationally binding on schedule? Subscribe and stay with us, because we will be tracking every development in Russia's ammunition capacity and every operational consequence it produces. The 90-day clock is running, and when it expires, the world you are watching will look different from the one you are watching now.